Welcome, friends, to a gathering place for the curious and the brave. Do you ever feel a shiver run down your spine on a perfectly ordinary day? Does the rustle of leaves in the wind sometimes whisper secrets in your ear? We delve into the realm of the unexplained. These are true stories, whispered through generations, passed down from campfire to campfire, each one abrush with the unseen. So settle in, adjust the lights, and prepare to be chilled. Tonight, we share true scary stories.
I heard this from a close friend of mine. He said it would be fine to share it, as long as I keep his identity anonymous. By the way, he's an avid hiker and loves the outdoor life. We often go mountain climbing and camping together, so I'll switch to the first person and tell you about his experience as if it were my own. I had wanted to climb a very snowy mountain in my region for quite a while, so I rounded up some friends of mine, and we made a party of 5 or so. We researched the climb extensively, and figured it would take us about 3 days and 2 nights to get to the summit and back down. The first day of the climb was very difficult. The temperature was below freezing, and the terrain was very rocky. We ended up expending a lot of our energy. It got dark at around 4 p.m. or so, making progress very difficult. We pushed on still, and managed to set up base camp. We pitched our tents once we'd made it to a flat area, which was kind of like a field of sorts. Fresh snow covered almost all of it, and all we could see was black and white. The sky was black, and the ground was snow white. Quite the contrast. It didn't take too long to drop off to sleep, despite the fact that I was shivering in my sleeping bag. Needless to say, I was very surprised when I was woken in the middle of the night. I could hear a voice calling from outside my tent. I was very groggy, and I almost thought that it must be morning. I couldn't see any light at all, though. At first, I thought it must have been one of the people I was out hiking with. I laid there in the dark, trying to get back to sleep, when I heard the voice calling again. "Hey! Hey!" I was very confused at that point, because to me, that voice didn't sound like anyone in our group. There was another off-putting thing as well. The voice almost sounded like it was coming from the direction we had just climbed up from. The voice was coming from the descent, if you know what I mean. I checked my watch and saw it was just past 2 a.m. I wondered if someone had been injured, perhaps. Maybe another hiker out on a trip. I woke up our whole party. We lit our lanterns and turned on our flashlights and called out in the direction I'd heard the voice coming from. "Is anyone out there? Are you hurt?" We called out, but the only response we got was the howl of the wind rustling through the trees. There was also the gentle sound of snowfall. It was as if the moment I'd called out, the voice had stopped calling at all. I didn't hear anyone else that night, but it did play on my mind, and I wondered what that was all about. I slept very lightly from then on. There was an ever-tightening knot of concern growing in my stomach. It was quite weird, and I was worried someone might be in trouble. But we had to move on regardless. I guess that I must have been hearing things, probably. After all, you can hear all sorts of strange things out in the wild. Could really have been anything. At least, that's what I thought in the moment. I tried to convince myself of that. However, deep down, I knew it was way too much of a human-like noise for me to mistake it as an animal. The following day, we continued our climb and covered a lot of ground. We crossed several peaks and pitched our tents again when the sun began to descend. We were in prime position to aim for the summit the next morning. I got ready for sleep. I was hoping to catch a couple extra hours that I'd missed out on the night before. I ended up waking up again, though, this time because I needed to use the restroom. I got up and headed out of the tent into the freezing cold to find a place to relieve myself. It was pitch black, but at least the light reflecting off the snow at my feet allowed me to see a little bit of where I was going. The moon was full, so there was some moonlight out. I was looking at it jutting out from behind the summit of the mountain and stopped to admire the view, and that's when I noticed something. I tried my best to get a better look, but it was quite difficult as all the snow was obscuring my view. There was definitely something out there. It looked like there was a light flickering in the distance, perhaps a small fire or the light of someone's lantern. I decided to call out to this person. The light immediately disappeared as if in reaction to my voice, and something strange happened. I heard multiple voices coming from that direction. Their calls carried on over the wind, and I heard them calling back to me. Hey, come over here!" I shouted back. "Are you okay? Do you need some help?" It sounded just like the voice I'd heard the night before, but I didn't receive an answer. I couldn't consider it a coincidence anymore. All I could do was head back to my tent and get back into my sleeping bag. Someone was trying to call me out to them in the middle of the mountains. Whoever it was trying to separate me from my party. The mountains can be very scary, especially in the dark, but thankfully nothing much else happened after. We climbed to the summit and made it back down without any further issue. While we were moving, I kept a careful ear and eye out for any signs of fires or people about, but I couldn't find any trace of them. I do wonder who was calling me and what might have happened if I did go in search of the owner of that voice. Last year, I was trying to sell my 2007 Mercury Mariner. It was in pretty good shape, but had a lot of miles and was kind of old. Overall, it ran very good though, and is a good car. I decided to list it on Craigslist because I've had experience with cars on there before. When I had used Craigslist in the past, it had always gone pretty well. So I took several pictures of the vehicle and listed it. The next day, I didn't get any interest at all, but on the second day after that, I did get a response to the ad. A text message came from a man saying that his name was Al, and he wanted to buy that car. He seemed pretty confident about it right away. I was asking a pretty reasonable price after all. I gave him my address to come and look at it. Now, I lived in an apartment building, so I didn't really think it was that big a deal to give the address. There were several buildings in the complex, and my car was already parked out in the lot. The guy would have no way of knowing which apartment was mine. I asked Al when he would be free, and he said he could come by the next day after work at 9 o'clock. I said okay and cleaned out the car a bit. I got ready to sell it. The following night, I left my apartment building and went to my car in the parking lot. Al showed up shortly after and parked nearby. He got out and I met him right next to my Mariner. Al was a big guy, had lots of tattoos, probably 250 pounds and 6 feet tall or so. After the meeting, I showed him the car and he looked around at it. After several minutes, he asked to take it out for a test drive. I went with him. Al drove the car around the block and down some nearby streets. I remember he said he really liked it, and everything seemed fine at that point. I was really thinking I was going to sell the car that night. After the test drive, we returned to my apartment complex, and he parked the car in the space that it had been before. After we got out of the car, though, Al said he would think about it. I was disappointed because it really seemed like he was going to buy it. I just said okay and said goodbye to him. And that's when Al asked me if he could use my restroom real quick. This seemed pretty sketchy. Why did he think it would be okay with me for him to use my bathroom? I said no thanks and started walking away. I was honestly afraid this might be some sort of a setup. I didn't want this guy coming up to my apartment. He was still just standing around by my car, though. My apartment building had a side door and the front door. The side door was not very far away. I decided to walk around to the front instead, and out of Al's line of sight. I left him standing there and headed inside. I was afraid that he was going to try and follow me, but once I got to the front doors, I looked all around me and didn't see him anywhere at all. This made me feel much better, and I entered the building. When I got inside, I turned right and entered the elevator. I took it up to the 3rd floor, which is the level that my apartment was on. When I arrived, I stepped off and started walking to the left. When I did, though, I saw that the door at the end of the hallway was already open, leading to the stairwell. I could see that Al was stepping through it. What was he doing here? At first, I started to go towards my door, but then I saw Al begin rushing toward me. I quickly stopped and turned and started moving in the opposite direction. At this point, I began to hear Al fully charging in my direction, so I started running as well, to the end of the hallway. When I made it there, I went into the stairs on the other side and ran down as fast as I could go. As I was moving, I heard Al enter the stairwell and continuing to chase me. I ran into the underground parking garage beneath the building. When I got down there, I ran across it to the other end. I had extended my lead on Al a little bit, but I heard him follow me into the parking garage and continue chasing me. I arrived on the stairs at the other side and ran up them to the ground level. I left through the side door. After I was out of the building, I ran to my car and jumped inside. Then I just left. I drove away and immediately called the police while driving off. I told them about this man. I drove around the streets nearby for a few minutes and then returned. When I did, Al's car was still there. He was not inside of it, though. The police got there just a couple of minutes later. I didn't dare to go back inside the building until they did, and when they did, they actually found Al attempting to break into someone else's apartment. It turns out he was never interested in buying my car. I guess he was just going to try and rob me or something. I used to live with my dad in Georgia, in a somewhat isolated area. For reference, I'm a woman, and I was 13 at the time this happened. My dad owned 5 acres of land, and a bunch of our relatives lived on the same property. There was a long driveway that branched off into separate mud and gravel driveways. Normally, during the weeknights, I would finish my homework and then decide if I wanted to listen to my stereo or watch some paranormal shows. On the night in question, I would say it was around 9 p.m. or so. I was getting settled down for the night when suddenly, out of nowhere, there came a tap upon my bedroom window. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and there were no trees anywhere nearby for someone to climb up. Needless to say, that really startled me. Most of my family were away at the time, so right away I was really freaked out. There was a large TV stand in front of the window, which was obscuring my view. I went downstairs and searched through the kitchen and the living room to see if I could find anyone outside. My dad usually worked late nights, so unfortunately I was home alone at the time. I thought that maybe he had forgotten his house keys or something, and started walking towards the front door to check if he was there. I couldn't see his car in the driveway. He usually parked by the front door window, so I didn't think it could be him. Directly behind the living room was a sliding glass door with long blinds. I could see that the light on the back porch was on, and there was the silhouette of someone standing there. Panic took over. I knew now it wasn't my father, and I didn't know if the door was locked or not. If I just stood there frozen in place, I would give the intruder a chance to enter my home. I bolted for the door to make sure it was locked. I stuck my hands through the blinds, too afraid to look outside them. Thankfully, it was. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a big knife to protect myself. I went back upstairs to my bedroom. Right as I turned my light off, there came a loud bang outside my window. I hid in my closet and called my dad to let him know what was going on. He confirmed that no one should be there and said he was heading over right away. Before he hung up, I called the police, and dispatch informed me that the nearest unit was 25 minutes away. I waited in the closet with a knife ready to strike at whoever tried to enter my room. The banging noises continued and sounded as if they were coming from every direction, almost as if there were more than one lunatic outside trying to get in. My dad and the police got there at the same time, but by then the assailants were already gone. The officers conducted a quick search of the property before taking my statement. My dad told me afterward that they had discovered multiple sets of footprints in the mud, going all the way around the house. I'm not sure what was scarier, seeing the figure on the back porch or knowing there were multiple people after me. Nothing ever came of it though, and to this day I still have no clue exactly why they were there. This happened over a year ago. I remember I had just left my family home before lunchtime to head off to my part-time job. I always walked to work back then. I was saving up for a car at the time. The walk wasn't exactly a long one either. It was pretty dull though. I grew up in a really rural place, and all there were fields and fields as far as the eye could see. The houses in my area were pretty spaced out and sparse too, which meant there wasn't exactly a whole lot of passing traffic. It was perpetually quiet. There wasn't ever much to look at on my commute. Like I said, there was just fields and a few houses, and a small cemetery along the way as well. On the day that this took place, there were no people on the streets at all, and no passing cars either. It was a particularly quiet day. I didn't like the feeling it gave me, like something was off. It was like my head was constantly clouding over. I think I was a little bit overtired because of the shift I'd had the night before. It had been pretty late and hard as far as part-time work goes. There I was, lazily marching my way to work, not thinking about anything in particular, when I suddenly sensed the presence of someone behind me. I felt as if someone was directly there. I didn't know when this person had begun to follow me, because I hadn't been paying much attention. I'll have to explain a little about my commute at this stage for the next part of my experience to make any sense. The road that I walked along to work was a big straight line. The straight line ran through the middle of all these open fields I spoke about. Most importantly of all, my journey along that straight line began the very moment I set foot outside my front door. There were no houses or buildings or winding roads or hidden lanes and alleys for someone to emerge from and start following me without me likely noticing. What I mean to say is pretty much everything around was visible. If there were someone in the field a mile away, I would have still seen them coming from pretty much any direction. So how this person managed to sneak up on me without me realizing was something highly unusual to me. While I continued walking, I wondered just how long this person had been following me for. I thought about it a bit more, and I began to realize that the person who was behind me was closing the gap between us. Whoever this was speeding up. I hadn't had a chance to look behind me, but I knew from the sound of these footsteps that this must be a man of some sort. The footsteps were getting faster and faster, and I decided to try and attempt to look over my shoulder and see who I was dealing with. As I looked back behind me, though, I noticed that the footsteps had stopped and there appeared to be no one there. I remember thinking to myself, "What the hell? That's crazy." I stopped and turned around so I could look back, and the strangest thing happened. I felt as if someone was staring at me, but there appeared to be no one in sight. I knew that someone was looking at me from somewhere. I could sense it. Some innate part of me knew that I wasn't alone. Something was there with me. I just couldn't see where it was. I immediately thought I needed to get out of there right now. I turned to leave, but my body wouldn't listen to me. I don't know if it was due to shock or surprise or fear, but I felt like I couldn't move a single muscle. I felt cold chills running down my back, like an ill wind was flowing through me. I don't expect anyone to understand what I'm about to say next, but this is the best way I can describe it. It was like my internal organs were suddenly cold, as if cold hands were groping around my insides, wrapping their cold fingers around me. I needed to get out of there fast. Something was seriously wrong here. If I didn't figure out how to do that, then something bad was going to happen to me. I couldn't bring myself to move, though. I felt arms wrap around my neck and the disgusting feeling of someone touching me. But just as suddenly as they'd started to grope me, I was released. I sprinted as fast as I could from the scene, not daring to look behind me again, as I ran and headed to my part-time job. All the while, that ominous sensation I'd felt did not subside. I tried not to think about it too much. I took some medicine at work, but the pain in my neck didn't go away. After I had some lunch, I ended up throwing up in the bathroom. I just felt so embarrassed. I finished work by the evening, and when my day of work was done, I still wasn't feeling any better. I had no appetite, so I went to bed without dinner. I couldn't sleep that night. I was shivering in bed, and my neck still felt terrible. I woke up throughout the night and vomited over and over. I was concerned for a while that I wouldn't be able to recover, but after a week I managed to return somewhat to my usual self. I was pretty naive back then, but from that day on I was very cautious whenever I had to walk that road. I walked along it many times since that day, but I've never encountered such an attack again. This happened when I was younger. I had a part-time job where I was collecting money for a newspaper delivery fee company. It was a pretty okay job. I didn't hate it, but I will tell you about one of the reasons why I ended up quitting. It was summer and a hot day. Whenever it's hot outside, I find myself easily irritable. I'm guessing you can probably relate. I was sent to collect a payment in a large apartment block. I had been doing the job for quite a while, and I had met a lot of different kinds of people and their families. People can be so different. Some were extremely wary of people they didn't know, asking them for money. When they realized who I was and why I was there, they would only hand it over through a small gap in the door and keep the chain up as well. These people were incredibly cautious of others. Then you get the ones who seem to not care anything about it at all. I've been met by people gladly opening their doors to a stranger, and even once a housewife wearing next to nothing basically. It was eye-opening just how different people can be for a young man like me. There was one apartment that I don't ever want to go back to though. I rang the doorbell like I usually did, and heard a child's voice. The door unlocked and the child opened the door a crack, then stared at me and shouted back into the house. "Mom, there's a strange old guy at the door." I thought to myself, come on, kid, I'm not that old. The boy's mother came walking down the hall smiling and apologizing to me. She told her son I wasn't a strange old man, and it wasn't polite to say that to me. I noticed there were a lot of children in that house. They were running around in the back. Their mother, I guess, went in search of her purse for payment. I wasn't the best with children at the time, so I was feeling a little uncomfortable. I was also irritated from the heat like I'd said before. The door had opened a little more by that point, and that was the moment that I noticed something quite strange. There was a little girl about 3 years of age lying across the shoe rack by the front door. I was shocked that I hadn't noticed her laying there before. It was an obvious and very strange sight. The mother came back to the door to provide payment. As I was absent-mindedly getting everything in order, I began to wonder, was something wrong with that girl? Why was her mother letting her lay across the shoe rack like that with all those kids running around? Didn't she care? I handed over the change and thanked the woman for her payment. I watched as she went to take a step backward to close the door. As I watched, I couldn't help but shout, "Watch out!" It seemed to me she was about to step right on her sleeping child's face. The woman fixed me with a confused stare and then planted her foot. I was sure I was about to hear the little girl start wailing, but I didn't hear a thing though. The little girl was still there as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. It took me a second or two to consider that I might be encountering something paranormal. I could clearly see there was a kid there, but no one else appeared to be able to see her or interact with her at all. The housewife was staring at me with an inquisitive look that slowly turned into a menacing glare. I don't know if that was just my own sense of paranoia or not, though. I knew I could see someone lying there, and no one else seemed to care, especially the homeowner. I got away from that place and called my boss. I said I was sick and took the afternoon off. I think I saw a ghost that day. I don't know. I mean, it's all speculation from me, but it was a very creepy experience. Nowadays, though, it feels more concerning to me than scary, I suppose. This happened to me when I was going to school in Los Angeles during the spring of 2012. I grew up in Indiana, in a very safe community, so it took me quite a while to adjust to the craziness and crime in the city. I was living in an apartment with 4 other women at my college. Our place was above a house, so to access it you had to go down a long alleyway and up some stairs. It was pretty out of the way. On this particular day, I stopped by the apartment to grab some music before choir practice. I came inside and started gathering up my materials on the kitchen table. I didn't bother locking the door, since I would only be there for a few moments at most. I was surprised by a knock on the screen door, and when I looked up, there was a man standing on the doorstep. He was a young Hispanic-looking man, medium height and wearing a t-shirt and jeans. Hello? I called out to him, thinking he was delivering a package or something. The man didn't say a word. He reached down and pulled open the screen door, then began to walk towards me. Still at this point, I was not yet alarmed, starting to say something about him leaving whatever package it was on the table, when I noticed that he didn't have one. The only thing in his hand was a box cutter. And by the time I realized this, he was already too close for me to escape. He put the blade up against my neck and told me to get up and walk into my roommate's room next to the kitchen. He locked the door and pushed me down onto the bed. My mind was racing, the whole time telling myself that he probably just wanted to rob me and that I would let him take whatever he wanted. As I was sitting on the bed, he started looking around the room. He grabbed some telephone cables next to the bed and began trying to tie my wrists together. It wasn't working too well, but he kept on trying. I eventually snapped out of my trance, though, realizing that this situation would become even more dangerous if he managed to bind me. I screamed and started hitting and pushing him. I made a break for the door after he stumbled backward. He caught me and tried again to tie my hands together, but I was thrashing and screaming. I kept hitting him in his head. After a few moments of this, he decided to bail and ran out of the apartment. I followed him screaming for help. One of my neighbors who lived in the house just below came out within seconds and saw the guy running down the alleyway. He chased him into the street, and we called the cops as well. They came right away. I ended up going down to the station, where I worked with a police sketch artist on a composite that ended up being posted on the television. They caught the guy within the week. The officer that responded to the scene said there was a local gang that apparently required new members to cut off the nipples of women and bring them back as an offering. Ever since this experience, I always tell people to lock their doors, even if they're just stopping by to grab a few things. You're better off safe than sorry. One time, I was going to buy a TV on Craigslist. This was years ago, but I would browse Craigslist at work all the time back then. Several times, I got really good deals, or even things for free. You never really knew what you would find there. You also had to be very careful, though. I remember I found this really good deal on a nice TV. I was in the market for one, and the ad appeared very legit. The price was a bit cheap, but not so cheap as to make one wonder if it was too good to be true. The pictures of the TV appeared to be in someone's home. I responded to the advertisement and said that I would like to purchase this TV if it was still available. Within an hour, I got a text back from the seller saying that it was. It was a woman who said her name was Joy. She gave me an address and told me to come over the following night to buy the TV. I looked up the address, and it appeared to be a house in a neighborhood that was about 10 minutes away. The next day, I grabbed up the cash and drove out to the address. I parked on the side of the street in front of the home, in what appeared to be a fairly average neighborhood. I think it was about 7 p.m. when I knocked on the door. It was quickly answered by a woman who looked to be in her 30s or so. Average height with some notably dark hair. She said hello and invited me inside. I stepped into what looked to be the living room of this home. There were many boxes around and stuff strewn here and there. It looked as if perhaps she was moving. There wasn't really that much furniture either. Joy said sorry that it was a mess, and I said it was fine. She told me the TV was in her bedroom and led me down the hallway. She stopped and opened a door at the end of it and said the TV was in there. I took a step inside, but as I did, I immediately noticed that the room appeared to be completely empty. Right after I stepped in, the door slammed shut behind me as I was pushed inside. It all happened so fast. I looked all around. Obviously, there was no TV in there. I turned back and saw Joy had closed the door on me without ever entering the room. I walked over and tried to open it, but it had been locked from the outside. This was so strange. I knocked on the door and yelled out asking what was going on, but nobody answered. I kept trying the door for a minute or two, and it just wouldn't open. I was yelling for somebody to open the door, but was getting no response. I realized this was not going to work. I looked further around the room. It was a small bedroom that was completely empty. There was literally no furniture at all. I got out my phone and tried to call up one of my friends. I was getting no signal in there, though. I thought that was quite weird. I kept trying to open the door and calling for help, but it was apparent that nobody was going to be helping me. I looked all around the room, wondering what on earth was going on. Several minutes into this, I began to hear noises coming from outside the room. It seemed like they were coming from the living room area. It was Joy, and the sound of a man's voice as well. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but I could hear they were talking to each other. I yelled again, but got no response. After that, I went over to the single window in this room and tried to force it open. For some reason, it wouldn't budge at all. I went back over to the door and started to bang on it as hard as I could. I wanted to break this damn door down. I heard a man's voice yell at me to stop from down the hallway. I didn't know what these people were capable of, so I did stop, but just for a moment. I took out my phone and found my alarms. I turned my volume all the way up and started playing the most annoying alarm noise I could. I then put my phone on the far side of the room. I walked over and hid behind the door on the other side. Within only 30 seconds, I heard somebody walking toward the room. They got right outside the door, and the door then opened. The man walked in and started going towards my phone, making all the noise. I ran out from the corner and hit him in the back of the head. I ran past him, leaving the room. He tried to get up and grab me at the last second, but I just barely slipped by him. I ran out and down the hallway. When I got to the living room, I saw Joy standing there. She kind of tried to stop me, but honestly it was a very embarrassing effort. I was able to slip around her easily. By now, the man had started to run after me. I threw open the door. As I was doing so, Joy grabbed at my arm. I escaped her grasp and got out. They were both still running after me. I sprinted for my car. Luckily, I still had my keys on me, not the brightest pair. I unlocked my car and got inside and sped away from there. Sadly, as I'd left my phone inside, I couldn't immediately call the police. I stopped at the first gas station I saw and went inside. I asked the employee to call the police. They got to the gas station soon, and after talking, we went back to the house. They recovered my phone on the side of the street about a block up. When they went to the house itself, nobody was there. They found out those people did not actually live in the home, and somebody else had been renting it. I don't know if those two were ever caught. When I looked at Craigslist again, the post was obviously gone. I just know that I'm never using Craigslist again after that. I once matched with someone on a dating app, and it completely put me off of ever using apps like that again. At first, we appeared to get on quite well enough for us to set up a date, obviously. Something about him and me just didn't feel like a great fit, though, during that. The reason why I didn't think we would ever become an item was because he came across as a pretty weird guy. He was more than a little bit intense, and after I rejected him, a bit stalky as well. Unfortunately, he already had my information, so sometimes I would hear from him. I would keep in touch with him just barely, via an app called Line. Honestly, he felt like the sort of man that if I ever blocked him, he might do something bad to me and fly off the handle. The intensity this guy had was just haunting. I really didn't want to provoke him. I know that sounds dumb, but that's just the way I felt. Eventually, though, I stopped opening his messages and just left them on unread. After a while, he appeared to get the picture and stopped contacting me. I know it's not nice to give someone the cold shoulder like that necessarily, but he left me no other choice. If I ever did reply to him, he would immediately pounce on it and bombard me with messages at all hours of the day and night. Now that he'd finally stopped messaging me, though, I thought that would be the end of things. I assumed he had now given up and moved on. One day, during a particularly cold winter in my city, though, something bad happened. It was freezing as I walked home from work. I didn't think that I could feel any colder. But when somebody suddenly jumped out in front of me from within a darkened alley, my heart felt like it was turning to ice. It was him, the guy I'd gone on a date with months ago. There I was, confronted by this creep who just tried to ambush me. I thought I had been successfully avoiding him. Obviously, I was really scared. He stood there blocking my path forward and didn't say anything. He was just glaring at me. I was shocked into a silence. I really didn't know what to say or do. After a couple of awkward seconds, I asked him what he was doing here. He said something like, "What's so bad about two lovers meeting? I mean, it's only natural I come around to see you if I can't reach you by phone, right?" What he said made no sense. It had been a good multiple months since we had spoken, and even longer since we'd had our one and only date. It made no sense at all. This guy was crazy. Fight or flight kicked in, and I just started to run. All I wanted to do was get home and somehow forget about this entire encounter with this man. I realized while I was running, though, that if he'd met me on my route home, then he knew where I lived. I realized it would be dumb to go straight home, so I stood there as it snowed down. I was in the archway of some disused building. I was frantically thinking about what to do next as the adrenaline began to subside. The solution was obvious. I needed to go to the police. I ran to my local Koan. Just to inform you, that's a station for police officers built at key areas in the city, such as in front of train stations or very busy shopping districts. The word in our language literally means taking turns to keep watch because it's staffed with officers at all times of the day just in case of an emergency. I had used this one several times and been grateful for their help. After I arrived and made the report to the officers this time, they said they would patrol my area just to be on the safe side. I felt reassured, but not exactly safe. If I'm being completely honest, after that night I turned into a recluse for a while. I developed a fear of leaving the house. 3 months or so went by, and there was no sign of that one-date wonder I'd matched with online. Slowly but surely, I regained some of my confidence. I went outside by myself for the first time in quite a long while. I was relying on the help of my friends and family up until then. I planned on heading to the supermarket. I knew the route, and I was close to the station nearby. I thought it was relatively safe. I got about 20 paces up my street when suddenly I heard a voice call out to me. I was addressed by my full name. It wasn't an oi or a cat call or something like that. Whoever this was knew me. The man shouted at me again. "Hey, Kana, I've been waiting for you." He crossed the road with a light jog and stood a couple of paces behind me. I could see it was the same man. "Hey, you don't need to call the cops on me, right? Don't you think what you did was a little bit mean, sweetheart?" I was so scared I couldn't make a sound. I knew I had to get out of here right now. I'm happy I chose the route that I did for my first venture out, as I knew exactly how to get back to that station. I ran there and reported what happened. The man fled, and I have to say that since then my life has been pretty incident-free. I guess the second reporting really scared him off, kind of. That's exactly how it was before, though, so I'm a bit worried I've been led back into a false sense of security. I feel like it might just be the calm before the storm. Once again, winter is rolling around and the nights are getting darker. When the snow begins to fall, I get scared. All those memories of being followed and ambushed by that man return to me again. Let me give you some background before I begin my story. This took place in the summer of 2014. I'm a woman who was 22, turning 23 that fall. I don't want to share my exact location, so I'll be making some minor changes for privacy reasons. I live in a small college town. I've lived there for my whole life, basically, and I've graduated from there as well. There's a lot of history in this little town. Unfortunately, we do have quite a drug problem here. Other than that, though, we don't get a whole lot of crazy around this place. I worked at a gas station that was owned by a family member. My husband and I worked opposite shifts. I was the early bird, so I would work the morning shift. I would get up around 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning and open the store by 5. I was never worried about walking out to my car in the dark because I grew up living in the countryside just outside of town. I loved being outside, especially when it was dark. I used to lie down in the grass and look up at the stars. My friends would come over, and they would always play Ghost in the Graveyard at night and do your typical teenager stuff during the dark hours, messing around, having a little fun. We owned about 4 acres of land, and no one ever bothered us, so I was used to being outside when it was pitch black with no fear at all. Now that you've got the background, let's get into the story. This is going to be in 2 separate parts, so bear with me, as both of these incidents occurred close to each other. As I mentioned before, it was summer of 2014. I was getting ready for work like I usually did. When I got into my car and started pulling out of my apartment's driveway, I noticed a man walking down the road, trailing a suitcase behind him. As I got closer, I began to wonder why on earth someone would be wandering down the street pulling a suitcase at 4:40 in the morning. I thought about pulling up next to him and rolling down my window to ask if he needed me to call the police or something, but I was a bit suspicious. Growing up, I'd been told not to pick up or talk to hitchhikers, so there was no way I was going to let a stranger get into my car. I also wanted to be a nice person, though, and was willing to help in any way I could. When I pulled out of the driveway, the man began walking right toward my vehicle. I remember losing my nerve immediately and just taking off down the street. I looked into my rearview mirror to see him just standing there watching me. I could just tell there was something off about this person. I was thankful I didn't offer to help him. Some of you might think, oh, you're just over-exaggerating. But why would this man start coming right at my vehicle? And what was he doing with this suspicious suitcase in the middle of the street at 4 o'clock in the morning? Once I reached work, I called the police and reported this suspicious activity to them. I told them I was a concerned citizen. I had been living in this neighborhood for 4 years and had never seen that man before. The police told me they would send a car out to patrol the area. Hours went by and I didn't hear anything back from them. I called the non-emergency line to inquire if they'd found anything. They told me there was no trace of the man. I brushed it off and went about my day, not really thinking about it further. I mentioned it to my husband after shift, and he told me it was likely just someone returning home from the airport or something. The nearest airport was about an hour's drive away, though. My husband thought I was just overreacting about the whole thing. A few weeks later, I was talking to one of my customers and brought up this strange incident. It's a small town and everyone talks to everyone around here. As soon as I mentioned the man with the large suitcase, my customer just about looked like he'd crapped his pants in front of me. He started telling me that the police had been discovering bodies in suitcases in our county. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight, and my heart began to pound out of my chest. The customer asked me if I remembered what the man looked like, but I hadn't really got a good look at him. I wasn't 100% sure if the man I'd seen was the mysterious suitcase killer, but I'm glad I hadn't stopped to help him. A couple of months later, I was again getting ready for work. I headed out the back door of my apartment. My husband and I lived at the end of the hallway, so I figured I would just park my car close to the back door. I thought it would be easier than going all the way down the hallway. Plus, a lot of the front parking spots are always taken. When you go out the back door, though, there are these large pine trees lining a cement pathway that guides you to the back parking lot. It was still dark out, and the instant I opened the back door, straight ahead I could see the dark figure of a large man sprinting right toward me. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut and rushed back into my apartment. My heart was pounding violently inside my chest. I was in full-on flight mode. I'd never run so fast in my life. The moment I reached the bedroom, my husband shot straight up and asked me what was wrong. After I explained what was going on, he stood up from the bed and headed to our door to look through the peephole. He saw nothing, so he opened the door crack and started looking around. There was no one there. I was still shaking, even when my husband walked me out to my car. I'm lucky to have such a great guy for a lover. Later that day, when my husband arrived at the gas station for a shift, he told me from now on to park in the front, where the lights are. The same week, I ended up buying some pepper spray just in case I needed it in the future. It's been about 7 years, and I still haven't used it, thank God. I want to warn all of you, even though you feel like you're safe in your own neighborhood, you still have to take precautions. Make sure you park in well-lit areas if you're going to work very early like me. Always have a can of pepper spray or some sort of protection, and you need to be aware of your surroundings because you never know if there's someone hiding in the shadows waiting for you to let your guard down. There are a lot of freaks roaming the streets, and you have to be careful out there. If something doesn't feel right, always trust your own gut. Sometimes I think I just have bad luck. I'm almost 30 years old and can't seem to find myself a nice partner to settle down with. I've gone on a million dates, I've tried the whole Tinder thing, I even had friends set me up on blind dates. I just can't seem to find that connection, no matter how hard I try. The story I'm about to tell you happened to me a few years ago, and I don't know if it was just desperation or plain old bad luck. It still haunts me to this day. It started on a beautiful summer day. I happened to be off from work on a Saturday, which basically never happened. I decided to try and make the most of it. I had recently moved to a new neighborhood a few months prior to the events of this story. I was kind of excited to see that my neighborhood was having a bunch of yard sales. I usually worked on Saturdays and tended to miss things like this. The fact that I could actually check them out really thrilled me. I visited a few houses on my street. They weren't really selling anything that interested me though. As I continued to make my way through the neighborhood, I stopped at a house that was selling a bunch of guitars and drum sets. Since I played guitar myself, I was interested right away. I grabbed this lime green acoustic one the guy was selling. While I was inspecting the instrument, I heard a voice call out from behind me. "Hey, sweet guitar, you play?" I turned around and said yes at the same time. What I wasn't expecting to see was a cute woman smiling at me. She absolutely was my type, dressed in a punk rock style covered in tattoos, and most notably had some really cool green hair. I'm not one to engage with people so easily, but she had a certain charm about her that sucked me right in. We ended up making small talk for nearly half an hour, right in this poor guy's yard sale. Finally, the guy just said I had to either buy the guitar or leave, since I'd been holding it the entire time. I told the girl it was nice meeting her, and then went and paid the guy. I remember walking home with the guitar in hand, kind of beating myself up that I didn't even ask for her contact information. I didn't even get her name. I remember feeling a rush of joy. From several feet behind me, I heard her voice. She called out to me to stop, and when I did, she ran over and grabbed my hand. "I know this sounds crazy, but I really like talking to you, and we had a connection, you know. I think it'd be crazy if we both ignored it. Would you want to hang out sometime?" I was so excited. I was trying to play it cool. I remember laughing and telling her my name, to which she replied hers. She said her name was Moon. Yes, Moon. We joked and continued our small talk for another few minutes. I eventually worked up the courage to ask her out for a drink, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when she said yes. We went to a local bar, had a few drinks, one thing led to another, and I asked her to come back to my place. Again, she went with it. We had an amazing night. We stayed up for a while playing Mario Party and ended the night on a high note. I went to bed in one of the best moods I'd ever been in. That very quickly changed when I woke up at around 4 in the morning. I noticed that she wasn't lying next to me anymore. I sat up in bed and noticed my bedroom door was shut as well, which I never did. I snuck over to the door and slowly opened it. I thought I could hear the sound of breaking glass coming from downstairs. I was still groggy from waking up, so I wasn't moving fast yet. I was going down the stairs shouting Moon's name. Before I went all the way down, I heard her yell something and then heard the back door slam. I finally started to move, and that's when I noticed I was too late. My kitchen had been completely destroyed. There was glass everywhere. Anger turned to sadness. This woman had not only trashed my kitchen, but also robbed me blind. My records were gone, my guitars were. I had a china cabinet that had a bunch of family relics in it, and all of that had been destroyed. She had taken everything I had of real value and ran out the back door. My logic was telling me there was no way she could have carried all that stuff out by herself, but when I got outside, she was nowhere to be found. Reality started to set in. I realized just how hard I had been played. This woman had a plan all along, and she had to have had someone else with her, because she never would have been able to get away so fast on her own. I obviously reported this to the police, but nothing ever came of it. I could describe her appearance quite well, but nobody matching her description was ever caught. Moon must have been a fake name, because nobody in the area knew about her when I asked. When I reflect on this now years later, I notice some red flags, like where did she come from that day? I never bothered to ask, but she hadn't driven a car. I had assumed she lived in the neighborhood. She was dependent on me the entire evening, and instead of looking at this as some type of issue, I was more into the idea she needed me. I never did get my stuff back, and now I'm more careful and selective with who I bring to my home. Be careful, because sometimes the people you think you can trust turn out to be the monsters right under your nose the entire time. When I was 15, I found a job in a local newspaper for a live-in babysitter. It was summer and I wanted to make some money. I lived in a rural area and did not have transportation to get to a mall or fast food place to work, the usual jobs for teens. There was no public transportation where I lived, and no jobs in the rural town I lived in either. I called the number for the live-in babysitting job, and a man answered. I found out he was a divorced man with 2 young children. They were school-aged, around elementary, and were home for summer vacation. He needed someone to watch them while he was at work. He spoke to my mother on the phone and somehow got her to agree to allow me to do this job. As an adult, I questioned so many of her decisions, and certainly this one. He picked me up and drove me to his house. While driving, he told me he had actually gotten re-engaged. He said his fiancée was his former babysitter, and she was just a year older than I was. As a 15-year-old at the time, this didn't set off any alarm bells. I just thought it was weird that someone my age would want to be with an old man like this. He was in his late 30s to mid-40s. I remember thinking it was weird too when I was taking the children for a walk, and a woman who lived in the neighborhood gave me an odd and concerned look, like something was wrong with me walking those children. I smiled and waved, and she simply looked away and ignored me. I didn't give it much thought, though. It all just seemed a little bit strange, and that was it. The house was a split-level home, a style where the floor levels are split. The main living area and the bedrooms were on the top level. The lower level had just a living room area and a single bedroom. That was my assigned room. Not long after I began living in the home to babysit for this guy, he began to try and sneak into my room after he thought I had gone to bed. Needless to say, I was pretty freaked out by this. He would always act friendly when I caught him, and asked me if I wanted a beer like he was cool with that. I would always say no and wait for him to leave, then slam the door shut. Eventually, after a while of this, I told him I no longer felt safe doing this job, and forced him to take me back home. I didn't fully understand at the time, but he was a predator who was trying to groom me into being another babysitter in a relationship with him. I knew enough at the time to know something was not right about the situation, and thankfully that was enough for something to tell me to get out of there before he could do anything further.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that little notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you have your own encounter you'd like to share, leave a comment below. Who knows, it might just find its way into a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the scariest stories are often the ones closest to home.